The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
And welcome back again, wrestling fans. Episode 602 of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant here with you. Today, the guest is former Old Dominion football coach Bobby Wilder. And why am I bringing a former Division I football coach onto the show? Well, as the wrestling community does know, that Old Dominion, which coincidentally is my alma mater, cut the wrestling program after 63 years on April 2nd. It was the first of so far 59 sports drops, and among those 59 sports drops are 2 closings at McMurray College and Urbana University since kind of the onset of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The global pandemic was used as an excuse by the Old Dominion press release, citing concerns about COVID-19. Well, we come to find out that there was a study that was put in place for 6 months that ultimately pretty much served as the death knell for Old Dominion wrestling. So why am I having Bobby Wilder on the show? Coach Wilder was let go from his coaching position after a 1-11 season last year, one that saw the Monarchs open a brand new stadium. Basically, they leveled the old Foreman Field, rebuilt what is Cornblow Field at SB Ballard Stadium now, and apparently it's a pretty good facility. I didn't have a chance to make it back to a game this year. This is only the second time since the team's inception that I have missed a game in person, at least during year. I've made a point to at least come home to Virginia to see one game a year, although I did see one road game at Pitt back when the transition year was going. So I did see Jared Brown set a Heinz Field record for longest field goal in that particular game. But Bobby is going to give us an insight on the other perspective of a college football coach, because when we have an arms race in college sports, and we have basically what I have always called a caste system, where basketball and football are elevated amongst the other sports at an institution, specifically in this case Old Dominion. It creates a little tension about why football gets this, while football gets this, while football gets this, where we're going to get the football perspective of, I guess, more or less those arguments. And Coach Wilder, we had a healthy discussion. We didn't always agree on everything, but also the relevance here to wrestling is Bobby Wilder's son, Drew, was a 2-time state place winner at Jamestown, just finished up his senior year, will be playing football at Navy moving on in the future, while his other son, Derek, is finishing up his last year at Old Dominion. So Coach Wilder is friends with Steve Martin, and he has an insight into, the viewpoint, maybe, I guess, of what it was like to see a football coach or hear from a football coach witness this, knowing that there's a non-revenue sport or Olympic sport that eventually got cut. So Bobby was really good with his time. I appreciate him reaching out and saying, yeah, heck yeah, I'll talk to it, because he's already done more than the Old Dominion administration did. Of course, fair point to note that he isn't employed by the university anymore, and I don't know if any coach would actually have talked on the record about this if they were still employed at Old Dominion, because, quite frankly, the president hasn't, the athletic director hasn't, and it's been kind of painful for those of us in the alumni and those that want answers. And I got 10 answers from the athletic director, Wood Selig, which you can read on the Q&A at MadTalkOnline.com. I have my responses to that Q&A available on my premium Rockfin channel at rockfin.com, ROKFIN.com/MadTalkOnline. But to the topic, Bobby Wilder, I wanted to have him on the show because of his son wrestling, and ultimately I never got him on the ODU Monarch Mattcast as the head football coach. But so here's a unique discussion about Old Dominion wrestling through the eyes of the former Old Dominion football coach, Bobby Wilder. And that is this, episode 602 of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. It's a Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant here with you today. Going to dive into the Old Dominion situation with former head football coach Bobby Wilder. Coach Wilder spent 11 seasons coaching the Monarchs from their inception, and the 2 years prior to that to building the team into the most successful startup football program in Division I history. Had a couple playoff runs in the football championship subdivision and a bowl victory, the Bahamas Bowl against Eastern Michigan. And The last couple seasons after that, Coach Wilder, got a little rough. You stepped down at the end of last season, but today the reason we're talking is about the situation at Old Dominion, and you've also got a pretty good relationship with wrestling. So before we dive into that, one, welcome to the program, and two, I was hoping to get you on the Monarch Mattcast over the years to talk about wrestling, but this will have to suffice. So welcome to the program.
Oh, Jason, I really appreciate you having me on as somebody like yourself. That obviously I didn't have the passion growing up for Old Dominion like you did. That's a great story, your involvement with Old Dominion and your family's involvement. But for the last 13 years, I've lived and died it. It was my life. Had the opportunity to build this best startup program and had a great relationship and friendship with Steve Martin, who I've always felt is one of the best wrestling coaches in America.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go back in time. When you get the job and you have that opportunity to meet Steve Martin for the first time, what is your initial impressions of him?
Oh, God. My initial impressions are, who the hell is this guy? I mean, Steve Martin is just a different dude. And anybody that loves wrestling, appreciates wrestling like you do. I'm a wrestling fan. My son just got done having 2 very seasons wrestling. Steve Martin is what you think of when you think of wrestling. I mean, everything down from the voice to the ears to how he presents himself. But the thing I always loved about Steve is what you see is what you get. I mean, he is a passionate guy. He's a husband. He's a father. He's an outstanding coach who built a tremendous program at Old Dominion. So, and I've been in touch with Steve since the time I was asked to step down as coach, and I have nothing but admiration and respect for Steve Martin.
And talk about the wrestling background. When did your son Drew wrestled at Jamestown High School? Was a state runner-up as a junior, finished 6th last year. And what got him into the sport of wrestling? I mean, how did he discover it?
Well, this is one of the all-time great dad stories about a son. 2 years ago, this year was a senior year. Last year, he was a junior. He calls me in December and he says, "Hey, Dad, the wrestling coach, they don't have a heavyweight. My son was in the 285 deal. They don't have a heavyweight. He wants me to come wrestle. What do you think?" And I said, well, he wasn't going to play basketball. He played basketball his freshman, sophomore year, and he just wasn't a skilled guy. So he might have made varsity as a junior, but he would have sat on the bench. He didn't want to do that. So he's like, well, it's either wrestle or work. And I said, well, you need to be into it. Wrestling's a different deal, man. If you're going to do it, you got to be focused and locked in. And he goes, well, I feel like I should because the coach told me he already bought new wrestling shoes for me. So I start laughing, Jason. I'm like, Drew, come on, man. You can't wrestle just because he bought you shoes. And he's like, nah, I think I want to do it. I want to give it a try. Well, they had already started. They were 3 weeks in to the season. So here he is, Jason. He's never wrestled before. He's basically wrestling because the coach bought him shoes, and now he gets into it and he starts to enjoy it, and he starts to learn some of the moves. And he's naturally a tough kid anyway. He's going to Navy on a full scholarship for football as a center. So he's 6'3", 285. He's tough. He's physical. He starts to figure it out. Well, lo and behold, Jason, he just gets on a roll. He wins the Eastern Regionals, gets in the states, makes it all the way to the state championship match as a junior. And he lost to a kid who was 46-4 and just more skilled than him. He got shut out 7-0. He just couldn't point the kid, but had a remarkable season and a great experience. And it all started with a coach who bought him a pair of shoes.
One thing wrestling people tend to pitch to football coaches is, especially with the linemen, is how much wrestling helps improve, mobility and lateral movement and such for a football player. How much did you see an improvement in Drew's football playing ability after stepping on the mat for the first time?
Oh, there's no question it helped him, Jason. It made him a better football player. So much of being a lineman is leverage, is how you use your feet, the position of your hands, where your head goes. We talk all the time in blocking, offensive line and blocking is trying to get your head in front of the defender. Well, think about in wrestling, Jason, how many of the moves involve the proper position of your head and where you place your eyes and where your chin is on your opponent. And he learned those things that he didn't know before and had a much better senior season because of what he learned on the mat.
Oddly, one of the wrestlers he was supposed to come back through in the consolations this year was a kid named Birchmeyer, whose older brother is the heavyweight at the Naval Academy. So there are some definitely some Naval Academy ties already. But as we look at
no doubt
last year, there's a picture that was floating around social media, and I thought it was one of the coolest things that we got to see because Virginia Tech head coach Tony Roby, his son was in the state finals in their classification, yet you had your kid in the state finals, and so did Steve Martin with Max making the state final. So you had two Division I coaches with their sons wrestling in the state wrestling championships the same year. So what was that experience like to share with Steve?
Oh, it was such a cool moment, and I got to spend last year with Steve at the States and this year as well because both our sons were in the States again this year. And what was really special for me, Jason, is I have the friendship with Steve that I've had going back 13 years, but I would sit with him at the matches and he would talk me through it from a coaching analytic standpoint. Obviously I'm a coach, so I'm fascinated by strategy and technique, but to be able to sit with Steve and talk through it and to be able to watch Max last year as a freshman, Max makes it all the way to the state finals and loses. Then this year he wins the state championship as a sophomore in the 106, and pound for pound, he's tough. He's just a tough kid. He's like his dad. So being able to go through that experience, and then last year after the state final matches, Steve and I and our sons Drew and Max, the four of us, took a photo together, which I still have, and I'll cherish that.
Now, as we look forward and we talk about this situation, we talked about the first time you had met Steve Martin, and what was your first reaction when you heard that Old Dominion was discontinuing wrestling on April 2nd?
I had a feeling it was coming, and not just because of COVID-19, Jason. I thought that the athletic department was going to make this move. I feel awful about it, but here's the facts right now. You got two things, Jason. You got Title IX, which will always be tough on men's Olympic sports that do not generate a lot of revenue. Sure, you've got some men's Olympic sports out there that do make some money, but if you're not generating revenue, it is so hard right now as a men's Olympic sport because Title IX protects all the women's sports. They don't have to make a dime, Jason. They don't have to bring in any revenue. They're protected because of Title IX. And then you get situations where, for example, at Old Dominion, the revenue sports are football, clearly makes the most money, then it's men's basketball, and then women's basketball brings in a little bit of revenue. But they're so reliant on gate receipts and then donor dollars. And, we have 26 suites that were sold out. We'd have somewhere between 10 and 15,000 season ticket holders. So we're bringing in a lot of revenue as a football program each year. Well, wrestling was not bringing in revenue. And Old Dominion looks and says, okay, how can we cut cost? How can we eliminate expenses? Well, here's $1 million program in men's wrestling. And then on top of it, you get COVID-19, where now there may not be a football season. They're going to lose that revenue. They just lost the NCAA basketball tournament revenue. And that's where men's wrestling at Old Dominion got caught in a storm and unfortunately got canceled.
Yeah, and when you say you saw this coming, is this is a conversation that's going on through the department? Because one thing I'm questioning about the whole process is blaming COVID-19 to me seems irresponsible. 2, hiding from the media seems irresponsible. But 3, it comes out that this survey was put out 6 months ago by a consulting group. And then everybody that I've talked to in terms of trying to find out who took the survey, a lot of the wrestling backers had no idea this was being conducted. Even Wood Selig, in one of his questions that he did actually answer, said that the questions of this survey didn't actually include anything about sports sponsorship. Do you believe that the writing was on the wall for wrestling before the survey was even distributed?
I do, yeah. I don't think there's any question that wrestling, the thought of dropping wrestling, has been around for a while. I've known about it. Other people have known that was a consideration. And when I say that, Jason, I mean, look at it this way. If you're looking and saying, okay, what can you do to save money? Are you going to drop football? No. Men's basketball, women's basketball? No. Well, what other men's sports are there? Are you going to drop baseball? what sport are you going to drop if that's your answer to save revenue? So there was always a speculation about it. And look at it this way, Jason, I'm a fan of wrestling. You love wrestling. What's the one men's program that's getting dropped around the country? It's wrestling. That's the program that's taking the hit right now. And here's what I would say, Jason. I would say we can't go back and change it at Old Dominion, but why not a year ago bring Steve Martin in and say, hey, Steve, look, man, here's what's going on. You better rally the troops.
That is the one thing I know I'd never competed for Old Dominion, but I consider myself a wrestling alumni. We never got that opportunity, because to say we're blindsided and then to hear you say that, like, you know what? Oh, well, there's some talks. Well, we're still raising money. I'm still getting the call on Giving Day. I mean, they're still raising money and earmarking it to wrestling. Why wasn't this program given a chance? Okay, you need to make sure we're not losing $1 million a year. We never got that opportunity, and then Wood actually emailed one of our alumni and threw out a $25 million figure, which was bupkis, because they've put the mats up for auction this week. So it doesn't seem like they were even going to give us a chance. So my question to the administration, why weren't we told? Do you think that was something the administration should have at least done for the wrestling program? Give us a chance?
Yeah, I personally feel like if I was an athletic director, I would put it out there and say, look, here's the deal. We've got some issues financially, which, to be quite honest, Jason, I don't fully understand the issues. To my knowledge, Old Dominion has the largest athletic budget in Conference USA. So I don't quite understand where all the money is, where it's all gone. I know that since I was let go and Ricky Ronnie was hired, he's got paid a lot more money. He's got a third more money for his staff. I was getting $1.1 million for all my assistants. He's up to like 1.6, 1.7. So there's certainly money there. I don't fully understand where the money went, but here's what I would say. If I was an athletic director, whether it was wrestling, whether it was women's or men's swimming, whatever sport might have been on the chopping block, I would look at a year in advance and say, look, here's what you got to go do. You got to go get this money. And I'm speaking as someone, Jason, who was told by the Old Dominion Athletic Foundation that I am the greatest fundraiser they've ever had. So I was always working my ass off going out to raise money, knowing that money was not earmarked just to football. It was for the entire athletic department. And one of my pet peeves was always, why am I out here all the time raising money when there's coaches of other sports that are benefiting from the money I'm raising that aren't out here busting their ass, or who aren't given a number by the athletic director to say, hey, you have to raise $500,000 this year, or you have to raise $1 million this year. And that's why I would, if I was an athletic director, Jason, before I dropped the sport, I would challenge a coach. This is the number you have to go get for your program. And I'd be doing it as a person who, my first year here, Jason, when I was hired, the first 365 days, I did 300 speaking engagements. I did 300 fundraising events for Old Dominion. So I just think, as an AD, before you drop sports, challenge that coach to help you financially to raise money. And I'm saying this not for Old Dominion. It's not going to help Old Dominion wrestling now, but for other schools like Louisville, Jason, just announced a 15% cut in their athletic budget. This is a school that gets $20 million a year in TV revenue for football. 15% cut. They're about to announce furloughs. They're saying they have to cut $15 million from next year's budget. So here's my statement to you, Jason, anybody listening. Before Louisville drops a men's sport, get with that coach, sit down and say, here's what I need you to go raise. Get on the phone, put the word out, tell all the alumni, tell everybody to save this sport. Here's the number you have to have. Why not do something like that? Coaches are great fundraisers. Give them a shot to save their program before athletic directors out there continue to cut, because we're going to see a lot more sports get cut, Jason.
Yeah, that's one thing I think that bothers me as an alum is, again, everything we were hearing is that, okay, Steve is hustling. Steve was raising money for his volunteer assistant, raising money. So the program was in a situation. I mean, I believe they had something from the MAC, but the point being is that we were all blindsided by it. And then it's kind of weird when we hear people are talking about it, but we weren't even told. We weren't given that heads up. Again, that's one thing I'm going to harp on a little bit. But to your point about Louisville, sure. Iowa State also across the board cuts of their coaches' salaries. And I guess I'm going to put you on the spot. Yeah. I guess I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you were still there, would you willingly take a pay cut to help save other sports at the school?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's something that's going to happen. It's just a matter of when Old Dominion announces it. Wood Selig, Ricky Ronnie, Jeff Jones, the new women's basketball coach. You watch all the coaches there'll be some percentage that will happen. That's coming at some point in the near future. It's just a matter of time. You look, and you're seeing this across the board, Jason. Look at other schools right now. I'm talking about presidents, vice presidents, deans of different departments. You're seeing this at major schools across the country are taking a percentage right now, knowing that the projections for next year are bad. And we're going to be in a really, really tough spot next year, Jason, for sports, because I truly believe there will not be college sports this fall. I don't see how university presidents can open their doors and allow kids to come in and cram them into dormitories and put them into classrooms of 200 people right now when we're not even anywhere close to a cure or any type of vaccine for this virus. I'm a father of a football player at Old Dominion. Derek Wilder, my oldest, has got another year. And I can tell you right now, I would not let him go back and go in a locker room with 115 other players. Now, the majority of this virus, we're saying it's people that are already sick or older people, but we have no idea, Jason, what the long-term ramifications are from this virus. So you can be sure I'm not letting my son go into a locker room with 115 players every single day until we have a better grasp on what's going on. And I truly believe presidents all over America for schools will not be opening their doors this fall and allowing students back. You're going to see classes online again like we're seeing right now, in my opinion, this fall. And you can't expect to have college football or any other fall sport for that matter if university presidents are not opening up universities. And I just don't see any way that happens this fall.
Right. And taking that into account, I'm looking at sports drops. So right now, I think by my count, we have lost 59 teams since the global pandemic has started. And that includes Cincinnati men's soccer. That includes Old Dominion wrestling. Those are the only two Division I schools to drop. We're seeing wholesale drops.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah, we see wholesale drops. Division II. One school in California dropped all their athletics. A school in Texas dropped 6. Urbana University in Ohio closed. McMurray College in Illinois closed, taking 18, 19 sports with them. So Sonoma State, a D2 in California, just dropped 3 schools. So it's impacting athletics. Definitely now we're seeing that where the income from this global pandemic is now starting to impact college athletes. But before this was even, before Old Dominion's first domino dropped, I guess hindsight says, well, why wouldn't ODU administrators start doing that like Iowa State did before they even had to get to dropping a program? It seems like everything I'm hearing is, again, this is your perspective. You're not employed at the school any longer, but it seems like, well, this was the last gasp. This was our last resort, where we just brought up 2 other resorts that don't seem to be taking, that weren't seem to be considered initially. And now it's almost like, well, after the fact, oh, now we might take pay cuts. It just seems almost, disingenuous to say, well, dropping it because of COVID, and we didn't really do anything to prevent this drop.
Yeah. I didn't get the impression, Jason, maybe I didn't look at it the same way you did. I didn't get the impression that it was dropped just because of COVID. I think that was part of it. But I do think, based on your point about the survey that was however many months ago and other aspects, things that I already knew, they were getting ready to drop wrestling. COVID might have added to it, but they were certainly getting ready for it. Now, the point that I'm making about this is just me speculating that Old Dominion Athletics at some point is going to come out and say, hey, we've got to take some pay cuts, or there's not going to be any bonuses this year, or we've got to furlough certain staff. There's something coming, just like I brought up a little while ago about Louisville. And it's not just going to be Louisville and Old Dominion and Iowa State and Wake Forest. Dave Clawson, their head football coach, is a friend of mine. He just took a pay cut going into next year. It's going to happen all over America, Jason. It's just a matter of the announcements. And you watch in the coming weeks, Jason, they're going to come rapid fire, because you know how this works. It's you can't be at a school and have a neighboring school, for example, make an announcement and you not do it. That would be like Virginia Tech comes out and makes some sort of announcement and Virginia doesn't say anything. You know, the type of peer pressure that would happen. There's going to be announcements there, and they're going to come fast and furious. And my prediction, Jason, based on my knowledge of inner workings of athletic departments, as well as what we're going through as a country that I'm paying very close attention to, you're going to see many more sports dropped. You're going to see athletic departments furloughed. If we don't have college football this fall and we get that loss of revenue again, because I just mentioned Louisville gets about $20 million a year for their football through TV, through the ACC network and TV. Take that $20 million out at every ACC school and that $45 million out at every SEC school. You're going to see a lot more sports that are either dropped or suspended. The NCAA is going to have to step in, Jason, and basically say, look, okay, they're going to have to step in and say, don't drop your sports. You can suspend them and bring them back. We'll allow that. I see something like that coming in the future for schools that don't want to drop sports they've had traditionally for, some of them, over 100 years. They're going to need some help from the NCAA. And here's the last thing I'll say on this, Jason, in terms of your question you just asked. There's a domino effect. Remember now, for example, a school like Old Dominion, I was part of helping them raise $10 million annually in donations that they would always say would go towards, paying student athlete scholarships. And that's what every school says. That money goes into the budget and helps in so many ways, scholarships and others. Where's that $10 million for Old Dominion going to come from this year, Jason, when so many business owners right now are hurt, and so many of them are going to say to Old Dominion, look, I know I was paying $100,000 a year for 10 years, but I can't pay this year. I don't have that kind of money. I mean, what are you going to do if you're Old Dominion? I mean, some of your top donors are going to come to you and say, I can't pay you this year. So not only are schools going to lose TV revenue, they're also about to lose donations from a lot of people, including the Jason Bryants of the world, who would always do whatever they could to help out. That maybe right now they've got to say, hey, look, I can't help you right now. That's coming also for athletic programs, and that's going to create problems all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a brick right here that where those bricks went for the football renovation in terms of what used to be Foreman Field. Now, when we move away from the COVID discussions, and of course, what you have touched on is kind of in the news right now with the G5 commissioners kind of submitting a proposal to the NCAA, asking for relief, and there has quickly been a coaches associations from all these for the Olympic non-revenue sports binding together, be like, no. Some places are going to be looking for this as a I think what was the quote that's floating around, Winston Churchill, never underestimate or never underutilize a crisis or something like that. But there are schools that clearly want to cut sports. They've had no opportunity to. And then there's situations where schools are like, we don't want to cut sports. We have to. And then there's situations, I think, that are in the gray area, which we saw with in my opinion, Old Dominions, whereas, okay, we're going to cut a sport. We're not even going to give them a chance to save it. That's, I guess, probably the hardest thing for me to swallow. Now, moving ahead to one reason that your perspective is valuable here is because Old Dominion added football, and when I was a student, I was very adamant in the Mason Crown, where I was the editor in chief, and I'd spent time writing in sports and WODU, that I would only be in favor of football at Old Dominion if we didn't cut any sports. That is because I've been researching Title IX and gender equity for quite a while at that point, through high school on through college. So I felt my role in there was to educate the students, like, look, we can't just add football because something's going to have to happen. And this is where I thought Old Dominion was different, because football comes. All right, we're going to add rowing. Makes sense. We're on the water, large roster sport. It's a situation where geographically it's logical. All right, volleyball. We're going to add volleyball. Great. This is a great volleyball area. Hampton Roads is a great volleyball area. Softball, also a great softball area. I figured, okay, looking at rowing is probably the outlier in terms of the local relevance. But, again, geographically with the water the way it is, I thought that was logical as well. And then we didn't add those sports in time. And then comes the move to FBS, which with it comes the additional scholarships from 63 to 85. And then the spending for your football program to keep up with the Joneses of the world and try to make, Old Dominion a desirable location for the athletes that are in the 757 and from out of state to be part of a bowl eligible FBS team. So where we get to is, do you think the move to FBS was too fast? And do you think that ultimately set the boulder rolling down the hill that kind of knocked the gender equity with scholarships out of place and not being able to add the sports in enough time to offset that gender equity?
Yeah, I'll be 100% honest with you here, Jason. And, people are probably going to say he's a football guy, so how can we believe what he says? But I personally, and I can back this up with some stats right now, I do not think that adding football is the reason wrestling was dropped at Old Dominion. You're absolutely right. Everything you said when you were a student and Mason Crown and educating people, if we add football, we needed to add rowing, which we did. We needed to add volleyball. It took a little bit longer to do, but we got it done. We were going to add softball, but we ran out of money. And then you say, wait a minute, okay, you were going to add softball, ran out of money. What happened? Here's what happened, Jason. About 4 years ago, we got hit with a really bad trifecta from a funding standpoint that I believe is the ultimate reason why Wood Selig made the decision to drop wrestling. There was a bill introduced called the Cox Bill into legislation in Virginia, and what that meant was there would become a cap on student fees, meaning that regular students that would pay fees towards athletics and funding athletics. And some of these were up $1,000, $2,000 a semester, and people were outraged about it. Well, what happened was when that Cox Bill got introduced, Old Dominion had to cut from 72% support for the athletic department on student fees down to 55%. You're talking millions of dollars.
Yeah, it's substantial. Absolutely.
It was. That was a big one. That was clearly enough to fund the wrestling program probably 3 or 4 times over. Just the Cox Bill cuts that we got hit with. Number 2, the TV deal just fell out in Conference USA. We were getting $2 million per school per year when we first joined Conference USA. That's enough money to fund the wrestling program twice. Remember, wrestling was $1 million. That dropped down to $250,000. We just got crushed with that. And then number 3, cost of attendance came about. That was about 4 years ago. So we fully funded cost of attendance for all 85 football players and men's basketball players. So there's 100. So you had to equal that with 100 on the women's side. Well, there was about $750,000 that was for the student athletes' cost of attendance. That's about $250,000 short of funding the wrestling program for a year. So all those things I just told you, Jason, bang, 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 they hit all at once and just really blindsided us. And I had numerous conversations with Wood Selig about this, with President Broderick. There was nothing that we could do other than try to offset that with fundraising, and we did the best we could. The coaches, especially myself, Steve Martin, you mentioned, we tried to offset it with raising money, but you're talking about $6, $7, $8 million. All of a sudden, we all just got punched in the face at Old Dominion. And when you're at Old Dominion, understand this. Yeah, we played Virginia Tech, beat them in football. Well, Virginia Tech at $20 million, gets $20 million every year from the ACC TV network package. They just get a check for $20 million. Our TV deal was $250,000. We just couldn't offset that. I think that is the number one reason why Wood Selig made the decision to drop the wrestling program.
Yeah, and one thing that also comes up, and I've been kind of banging the drum on that every athlete is important. And one thing about the strategic review that drove me bonkers was saying the investment in the valuable sports. Now, I was with the wrestling program my entire time as an undergrad. I was hanging around the swimming team and the diving team, all the non-revenue sports. This is before we even had football. I graduated in 2004. So the non-revenue sports kind of hung together, and then men's and women's basketball kind of did their own thing. And then walking around campus, that first home game, that first game against Shawan, I'm walking around. I wasn't even married yet. My fiance and I at the time are walking through, and I'm like, this is tailgating. It was an amazing experience. It was great. But at the same point, you talk about the cost of attendance and whatnot, and then the athletes that are equivalency and versus the athletes that are head count. The head count athletes are already getting a full boat. My question, of course, on the cost of attendance is, okay, well, what about the guys that actually need that extra bit? I mean, I'll be honest with you. I was living with wrestlers, and we were finding unique ways to use coffee filters. I think people in the COVID-19 era can kind of draw the connection of what we're doing here. We were poor, man. We were poor. Those athletes are the ones that need the money. Yet it seems like there's the haves and have-nots even within a school. And I dislike the caste system that college athletics has kind of done, where football and basketball, okay, yeah, they're deemed the revenue sports. They're important. I don't feel that student athlete is any more important than, like Ryan Williams, the NCAA finalist that put Old Dominion on ESPN in 2008 versus, Jonathan Plisco. It's the question is, why are those two? Why is one athlete weighted higher than the other? So that's probably more of a philosophical discussion. But I want to dial this back to scholarships for a minute, because the move to Conference USA increased the reliance on 22 more headcount scholarships. So that right now looks to be the difference with the Title IX scholarship funding. So would you have been happy staying FCS, I guess, is the first question. And two, how much do you think, not football, but the move to Conference USA may have really, again, to kind of get to my previous question, set this in motion? Not the addition of football, but if we'd have stayed FCS, how do you think this would have reacted? Because to my knowledge, the bill impacts FBS and FCS schools a little differently with the student fees.
You're talking about the Cox bill?
Because I'm looking at $28 million in student fees in 2018, based on the Knight Commission report, right, where we'll go back to 2010, for example, and we had $23 million in student fees. So, granted, I realize the revenues and expenses have increased, so the numbers, it's a percentage. I think my wife and I did the math. It's like covering an extra $3 million a year just based on student fees off the top before we get into the TV funds. I'm just wondering, the move to see the Conference USA making the school have to account for 22 more scholarships, whereas wrestling only accounts for 9.9 scholarships.
Yeah, there's no question, Jason. We can look back now with hindsight and say maybe that move is what killed wrestling. I don't think it's fair to do that, because the information we had at the time, there wasn't a Cox bill, there wasn't the TV deal getting crushed.
There wasn't the realignment. We didn't have East Carolina bolting and Houston and SMU. The conference, right. Obviously, the profile was impacted clearly. I mean, I'm not gonna be a denier of any of this.
No, but I'm saying that you can look back at it and go, well, why the hell they do that? Football killed wrestling. But I don't think that's fair to do, because the information we had at the time was that it was going to be profitable. It was going to bring more revenue. It was certainly going to bring more exposure. It was going to be better for the school. I mean, and think about this, Jason. I would argue that the most impactful sports moment ever in Hampton Roads in this region was our win over Virginia Tech in 2018. That got worldwide attention.
Literally, like I said, I was in Slovakia. I'm talking to Doug Ripley at 2 a.m. about this thing.
Yeah, so you don't get that type of exposure for beating Albany when you're an FCS school, or beating Towson. You're playing and beating Virginia Tech, or when we were in the FCS playoffs, that was exciting. But when we were in the Bahamas Bowl, we were the only game on ESPN on January 23rd at 1 o'clock on a Friday. Everybody in the world who was watching college football was watching Old Dominion win a bowl game and win our 10th game in only our 8th year, which set a record in 150 years of college football. Nobody had ever won 10 games in their 8th year and a bowl game. So you have to offset that with the amount of attention and what it brought to the university, how that impacted fundraising. The people in ODAP say The bowl game win in 2016 and then the Virginia Tech win in 18 are the two biggest, most impactful things in terms of fundraising. So how do we quantify that, Jason? How do we quantify the money that those wins did for Old Dominion? And then how do we offset that with, bang, here comes the Cox bill, or here comes the TV deal going under. So, we can argue it all day. We can point things out both ways. Did football kill wrestling? You could make that argument. You could say it did. But then you can also make the argument that wrestling never would have been dropped if we hadn't had to go from 72% student fees to down close to 50% because of the Cox bill.
Yeah, I mean, I get all that too, and I mean, I'm not coming in this. My question again, as an alum, is the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and for example, in hiding from the media. But also to your point though about the Eastern Michigan Bowl win and the Virginia Tech win. On the flip side of that, and I'm not kicking you here, but last season there were empty seats for the first time in that stadium's history. And people weren't showing up,
and that's why I am no longer. That's why I am no longer the coach. And here's a point I'll make to when you're a head coach of a football program that's counted on for revenue. Okay, when Wood Sealy got hired as the athletic director for the 2011 season,
mm-hmm.
his first time walking into that stadium as the AD was all 20,000 seats full. All 26 suites sold, him knowing he was going to have at least $1 million in revenue from the football ticket sales before we even kicked the ball in the air. So when you're a coach, my point, Jason, when you're a coach like I was of a Division I football program, you're counted on to fill those seats. Okay, Steve Martin, the wrestling coach, Heather Holt, the women's lacrosse coach, that nobody expects them to generate any revenue. So part of the reason I got fired, and I did get fired. I mean, I resigned to make it easier on everybody, but I was told they didn't want me back. Part of that reason is because I didn't keep the seats full. So not only did I have to win games, I also had to keep the seats full and keep the donors happy, the alumni happy. So it didn't matter, Jason, that like Heather Holt, who's a really nice person, our women's lacrosse coach, she never wins, but she graduates all her kids, and they do great in the community. They win this award in the athletic department for community service every year. There's nobody in the stands to watch them play. They're a family and friends sport, but she's not going to lose her job like I did because there's nobody in the stands, and you're losing revenue that you've never seen before. When you're Wood Sealy, the AD, and showed up, all the stands were full. Everything was sold. You get my point, Jason?
Absolutely.
That's part of the cross you bear as a revenue sport is you better keep generating revenue. Doesn't matter. I graduated my kids who were good in the community, very few issues off the field for a roster of 116. All that stuff, I did great. I get an A+ and all that stuff. But 3 years ago, had us in a bowl game, sold out. This past year, 1-11, empty seats, and I'm out of a job.
Yeah, and again, I never missed a single game, and since even though I was giving cautionary tales before we even added football, I never missed a game, and whether it was be in person, whether it's watching on TV or watching a stream. I watched the Campbell game from the lobby at a hotel in Moscow. I watched the Jacksonville game.
You're a dedicated dude if you did that.
I watched the Jacksonville game from a hotel in Denmark. I listened to the Citadel game in Budapest, Hungary, the one that was 59-58. We talked about the Tech game. So again, I'm not trying to make this.
Hey, Jason, let me make one point. You just mentioned Shawan, you mentioned Campbell, you mentioned Jacksonville, you mentioned Citadel. Okay, now ask me again, why would you move from FCS to FBS? Go ahead, ask me.
Well, I'm gonna counter that with James Madison, William and Mary, Norfolk State, Hampton, games of local interest. Of course, those early years, your startup schedule, of course, I'm going to give you a pass on that.
And I'm going to counter that with East Carolina, Virginia,
absolutely,
Virginia Tech. That's the reason why. That's another reason why there was also opportunities for much more revenue, but playing at the highest level, playing games on national TV. That was part of it. Now, would I have been happy staying at FCS? Absolutely. Let's say the conference realignment of 2012 never happened, Jason, where teams were jumping into you got at the highest level, Missouri, Texas A&M going to the SEC, and then you had Louisville going to the ACC. All these teams were moving, so it created space in Conference USA. There was an opportunity, and a big part of it, Jason, was men's basketball. I don't want your listeners to think this was all football. Wood Selig was talking to the AD from, oh God, what's the name of the school? I can't believe this. Our most hated rival in basketball.
Oh, that school in Richmond.
Yeah.
I won't even say it on the show. I'm not even going to say it on the show.
Well, so he's talking to their AD at the Final Four, and he says, "Hey, look, we're leaving. We're going to leave. George Mason's going to leave. So now Wood's thinking the CAA is going to fall apart in basketball. Remember, they were just a one-bid league even then with that school in Richmond going to the Final Four and George Mason.
They have wrestling, so I can say George Mason. I'll say their name because they actually have a wrestling team.
But you get my point. He was thinking the CAA is going to fall apart too for basketball, and which might not help football. Who knows what all the schools would do with this reaction by the basketball team. So you had all these things hit at once, and when he explored the move to Conference USA. And a lot of our other sports, as you know, aren't in Conference USA, and a lot of them weren't in the CAA, because the CAA didn't sponsor all those sports. So that was another part of it as well when we made that decision and made that move.
Yeah, again, a lot of it's hindsight too, which is where I'm kind of pointing to the decisions that led to the wrestling team's demise through no fault of their own. And that's kind of another point that I'm kind of harping on is, if there's a decision and there's a mistake that's made or there's a bad call, you go back and look at it. Well, who do you blame? Usually it's the leadership. It's like, okay, they made it. Well, they're not the ones that have to suffer for this. It's 63 years of alumni and then 30 guys on the team. So I guess this kind of leads to my other question. Is the Division I model broken because we're basically pitting the non-revenue athletes who have every right to compete in their sports at the college level? And according to the NCAA, I believe the NCAA has a charter comment about the opportunity for sports. And then it's like, it seems like men's and women's basketball and football pitted against men's and women's soccer, baseball, wrestling, water polo, whatever it may be. It seems like, again, that caste system that I kind of allude to, it seems like the athletes are kind of, there is a groundswell of anxiety and angst towards power programs because no matter what they do, they check all the boxes. They say they're being fundraised correctly. They're, again, all the things you talked about with Heather Holt with lacrosse, the community service, the grades, the graduation rates, the APR, all that stuff. You can do all that and it matters nothing. That to me is one of the biggest problems with this decision is you can do all the right things and it's still taken out of your hands. And I guess that's the one thing that I grumble with. I think the wrestling people grumble with, and because we've been dropped other places. Thankfully, the Division I tide of cuts has been slowed. We've added over 200 wrestling programs across all divisions, including 70 women's programs recently. But I guess the question is the way athletics works, and you being a football coach, do you realize that some of the optics on this is it's football against everybody else, and when something goes wrong with a football program, the football program doesn't pay for it. You might personally have paid for it with the job, but it's another sport that takes the hit. So, I mean, I guess maybe there's a discussion to be had about that model and maybe what needs to be fixed, how to prevent this type of thing. Again, that's where being a non-revenue sport guy, being an Olympic sport guy, kind of hurts because no matter what we do right, it's always going to be out of our hands.
Yeah, you're bringing up some really good points, and I want to make sure your listeners understand. You and I are having a good back and forth here as a couple of people that respect each other and appreciate each other. And I'm sick to my stomach that wrestling got dropped at Old Dominion. I'm sick to my stomach for Steve Martin, who's my friend, for the kids on that team, for good friends that I've got. Alumni of Old Dominion or fans of wrestling. I'm friends with the donors for the wrestling program that are just sick to their stomach right now and hurt because of what happened. And if you're looking for an answer, here's what I think the answer is. This is my 2 cents as someone who spent 32 years in athletics, was a coach of a football program. The revenue, non-revenue thing, That's up to the alumni. That's up to the fans. The fans pay for what they want, Jason. That's the bottom line. You know, if you're a fan of wrestling, don't hate football because 20,000 people want to go to a football game at Old Dominion and 100 might show up for a wrestling match. Don't hate it because 110,000 people go to a Penn State game and it's on national television. It makes millions of dollars. Go support your sport, support your program. If you love wrestling, support it. You know, step up financially. I would call people up. I would call donors up and say, hey, look, I need $50,000. I called a donor last summer. I need $50,000 so I can have training table on Monday and Tuesday night. The 2 nights I want to make sure my players get a great meal because that next morning at 6 a.m., those are our hardest practices of the week on Tuesday and Wednesday. To do that for 14 weeks, Jason, on a Monday and Tuesday night during the season, I needed $50,000 to feed 120 kids. I called the donor up. He wrote me a check for $50,000. So don't tell me it can't be done. Don't tell me you're the coach of an Olympic sport and you can't call up the Jason Bryants of the world and say, hey, look, Jason, I know you can't cut me a check for $50,000 right now, but can you help me with $1,000 for the year? I need this. I'm trying to be able to do training table for my team, or I'm trying to be able to add $100,000 to my budget so the AD sees the optics of me adding $100,000 to my $1 million budget. I'm saying, hey, this year I'll pay 10% of my budget, my $1 million wrestling budget at Old Dominion. Next year I'll get it to $200,000. I'll pay 20% to make sure you protect my sport. You know, do whatever you got to do to save your sport. Get your alumni, get your fans involved. You want to know why there's revenue and non-revenue sports? It's supply and demand, Jason. That's what it comes down to. Football didn't start out that way, and it sure as hell at Old Dominion there wasn't football until I got hired in 7. We played a game in 9. I spent 2 years out beating the drum, selling season tickets, doing everything I could to get people to come to the games, and they showed up. So it can be done, and we can save all these Olympic sports out there, but we've got to get people to get involved now. We got to get people to call the athletic directors at schools and say, hey, is there any danger? I want to know right now, is there a danger that my swimming program that I love might be dropped? Or is there a way we can start a fundraising arm for that sport to guarantee you don't have to drop it? Those are the things that are going to have to happen now and happen fast for Olympic sports.
Yeah, we've been beating the endow your program, endow your head coaching position drum for a while. There's a couple programs that do that. Now, you talk about the supply and demand.
Look at our men's golf program. Do you know what Murray Rudisall has done with Old Dominion men's golf? He's endowed all his scholarships. He does a huge fundraising 3-day golf tournament every year. Murray Rudisall is a genius.
He's been there he's been there 100 years too, man.
But you should talk to him, Jason. I'm telling you should call him and talk to him because he pays for his sport. Imagine being a guy. Now I realize there's only 6 golfers on the team. I get it, but you got to travel. You got to do this and that. You got to pay for scholarships, and the guy runs a 3-day tournament every year, a fundraising tournament, makes thousands and thousands of dollars. I'm not sure how much. He pulls in a ton of money. But that's an example of what I'm talking about that's got to happen across the country. And my question to you, Jason, I don't know enough about it. Where's the United States Olympic Committee in all this with the millions of dollars that come in for the Olympics? I know they have to fund athletes and training, but is there a way they can get involved and help out?
Well, I know that they're cutting staff. They're cutting that just came out. Actually, I was looking through my news feed this morning that the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Training Center, which I worked near in Colorado Springs for 3 years, they lost revenue out the wazoo because guess what didn't happen this year? The Olympic trials were set to be in wrestling, for example, were at Penn State. They were sold out, basically minutes after the tickets went on sale. This is an Olympic year. Their trials, all the trials wiped away, basically. So, that's a good question to bring up if they're an event-driven organization too. So a lot of that reserve they had is basically being liquidated to kind of cover fees. And I saw where their staff's getting furloughed and taking pay cuts, and they're being let go too. So again, with an event-driven organization, I know that USA Wrestling, where I used to work, is dealing with that. We've seen it with the NCAA. I'd mentioned this before. I was the PA announcer for the Division III championships in Cedar Rapids, and the Thursday before we blew the first whistle, I'm the one that had to tell the kids that their season was over the PA system. So the NCAA loses that revenue. The NCAA lost the money they made on lacrosse, and their championships make money, not just the Final Four, but College World Series. Right. That's a big one. Right. So I think the USOC, or excuse me, the USOPC, its official title now, I think they're kind of in that same boat. I can't speak on that with any authority other than the headlines that I read this morning before we started the call, which was interesting timing there. So that's the one thing I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but I do know that the coaches associations, as I alluded to earlier, are kind of banding together to try to stop the bloodletting that's going to be coming. But
that's what's got to happen, Jason. People, I'm talking, there should be a super committee formed. There should be people like yourself on it, coaches, athletic directors, fundraising organizations. There has got to be a serious grassroots movement starting yesterday, or this is what we're going to see. We're going to see Olympic sports get dropped. And you can say it's unfair. You can say, here we go again, football, men's basketball. But people aren't going to touch their revenue sports. They're going to try to protect their revenue sports as much as they can. Anybody that brings in revenue right now has just become more valuable than ever. And any sports that don't generate revenue, their heads are on the chopping block. It does not matter what sport you are right now. You had better find a way to, number one, generate revenue. And if you can't, if you're a family and friends sport that doesn't sell tickets to games, you had better raise money right now for your program. You'd better walk into the AD and say, hey, look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come up with a way to, over the next 2 years, fund 25% of my budget. You better have something that shows that athletic director that you're not just going to be a financial liability. You're going to have a way to be a financial asset. And I don't mean to sound cold or unrespectful. That's not the case, Jason. I love the Olympic sports, all the coaches. I talked about Steve Martin, Heather Holt. They're all my friends. I don't want to see any other Olympic sport anywhere in America get cut, but you got to show a way you can bring value other than just saying, hey, we deserve the same opportunities as the football team or the men's basketball team. That's not going to cut it right now in a dynamic like we're in with the COVID-19 and all the money that has been lost off the NCAA basketball tournament. And if it happens, if we don't have football in the fall, Jason, which I personally don't think we are, look out. This is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So we've got to find ways to brainstorm to try to save all these sports while we get through this crisis.
And with that, I want to just touch on the Olympic sports and the supply and demand discussion just for a little bit. Again, one thing that, and I'm not trying to beat up my own alumni fan base here, but I mentioned earlier before we started recording, my older sister went to Old Dominion back in she graduated high school in 1979, was at Gresham Hall when it was brand new. That was very few dorms at the time. When I was there, Whitehurst was still considered the new dorm, and all the athletes lived in Powhatan because there was no University Village. The field house was still there. So we're looking at, it was really a commuter school. We have a lot of alumni that their only connection to sports was men's and women's basketball because that was the only thing that was nationally competitive. I was a sophomore in high school watching Old Dominion beat Villanova in triple overtime, watching every second of that game. That is a game that, like the Virginia Tech win in football, the Villanova win, the 14-3, Petey Sessoms going nuts. That was one of the games that also did it. I was there in the field house when Old Dominion women's team beat Tennessee the year they met later that year in the national finals in 1997. So again, the sports, but again, the fan base, it was always kind of, it was a mid-major, and it was probably on the middle to low end of the mid-majors because the only two sports that got promotion were men's and women's basketball, which, we're talking decades worth of exposure that wasn't given to men's soccer, which during my time as a student was ranked as high as number 2 in the country, or baseball, where 50 people showed up to watch Justin Verlander, who was the number 2 draft pick, on a really bad baseball team. So part of it is what was done in the past. Again, this is all hindsight here. This is kind of affected how our alumni base looks to the sports with supply and demand. Great football. We're a football area. We got Hampton, we got William and Mary, we got Norfolk State, we got ODU, all within that little area. Apprentice School, let's even count them, and CNU, that all have college football teams in the metro area. So the desire and the hunger for football is there. But I guess some of it is we were a commuter school for so long that we didn't have the only people that were really part of the alumni base to go see these matches had wrestled there. And I guess that kind of goes to the long question here is how much of those sports donors were basically siphoned off to help football and that thing. So are you in a situation where you've seen donors kind of either or? I mean, I guess it's not really a question. It's more of a what was that situation like where you had somebody that was maybe giving to soccer that says, hey, can you give us over to football here so we can get this thing going? Or am I just barking up a wrong tree here?
No, I'm laughing because when you mentioned that, when I first got hired, Jim Jarrett was the athletic director, and he was not supportive of football, and his major concern was football would just chew up all the other sports. And Jim Jarrett was really smart, Jason, in the fact that he had tiered sports. You were tiered based on how much money was going to be put into your program and how much revenue you generated. So, for example, men's basketball, women's basketball was at the top of the tier when I arrived. I don't remember where all the other sports were, but it was all based on the revenue you generated, the fundraising ability for your sport. So if you were a sport that generated a lot of money, you got a lot more money. And I think there's a fairness to that. It's not unlike our system in America, Jason. If you're great at your job, you get promoted and get more money. If I have the same job as you and I suck, I shouldn't get the same money as you. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and look at Steve. Steve got the job. We had 6.6 rides. Then 3 years in, he gets an All-American. They're fully funded. So under that, right. I guess the incentive.
And that's my point. When I got hired, there was a system in place that had to fit that. And then I made sure when I got hired, Jason, I wanted to be clear to answer your question specifically. I stood up in front of the entire athletic department and I said, look, you've all got your own donors that donate to your sport. Jim Jarrett included me in. I'm not looking to come in here and peel from you. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do whatever I can to help you. You tell me what I can do. I don't have to coach this year. I'll come to your events. I'll come to you. I played in Steve Martin's golf outing. I spoke at it. I spoke to Alan Dawson, the men's soccer coach, to his donors about athletics and about what the football program would do to help the university, the athletic department, not taking away from any of those sports. So I made it clear from the time I arrived. Now, when you ask about siphoning donors, I don't ever remember a donor specifically being like a Steve Martin wrestling guy and then he jumped over to football. And I don't remember Steve Martin ever saying to me, hey, one of my guys is no longer giving to me because he bought a suite at your stadium. So I don't think that happened. I do know this. They went from bringing in about $3 million a year to last year they brought in almost $10 million. So did football hurt or help? If I say $3 million when I got here, $10 million last year, I'd like to think that football helped generate more revenue and we didn't hurt any specific sport or their donors, because none of the 16 head coaches ever came to me and said, hey, don't talk to so-and-so or you stole so-and-so from our program.
Now, there's the point of the revenue, and I'm going to be frank when I say, well, what about the expenses? Because the department in and department out, a lot of college sports
here's what our budget was last year, Jason. Here's what our budget was last year. I know for a fact Old Dominion's athletic budget was $42 million, and last I heard that was $10 million more than anybody else in our league. Our football budget last year was a little bit under $10 million. That's the last number that I saw, and that was less than James Madison's football budget, an FCS school. Our coaches' salaries, I was 13th out of 14 coaches in Conference USA in salary. Mine was $650. There was one coach in the league making $1.8 million. There were 7 coaches over $1 million. My assistant staff salary pool was $1.1 million. That was 13th out of 14th in the league. Ricky Ronnie, the new head coach, his is up to $1.6 million. So you can't say to me, or nobody else can ever say to me, well, football just got way too much money, because the numbers I just told you, compared to the other 13 teams in Conference USA, we were at the bottom in almost everything that we got for revenue. And I know for a fact there's other coaches at Old Dominion that the number 1 paid coach or number 2 paid coach team in the league for their sport relative, I was next to last. So I don't ever want anybody to say to me, you got too much or football took too much, because that's not the case at all, Jason.
Could you have spent less? I guess that's another question to ask here.
I don't know how we could have possibly spent less.
Gotcha.
I had
Okay.
the least amount of staff in the league. I didn't have a secretary. My recruiting coordinator made $30,000. Other schools made $110,000. My strength coach made $60,000. Other schools like Florida Atlantic, their strength coach made $250,000. I could go on and on and on.
Okay.
I don't see how we could have, and it's part of the reason why we were 1-11 after we went 10-3 in 2016. 0 increases across the board. Other schools invested in facilities and staff infrastructure, and we got passed by in the league. And that's why they asked me to leave, and the new coach got a hell of a lot more because they finally recognized what I had been telling them. You can't expect to beat these other schools when your revenue is so much less than the other schools. Now, Jason, you're asking these questions, and I know why you're asking them. Why the hell did wrestling get dropped? Well, that's a question only Wood Selig could get answered with the largest budget in the league and a football program that wasn't chewing up everything. We were about 25% of the department revenue, and I was raising a hell of a lot of money, and we were selling out our stadium until last year. So I don't know, to answer your question. I don't know where the revenue went. I'm sure you can do your research and find out a lot about other sports in relation to Conference USA and the money they were given for their budgets.
Yeah, my FOIA requests about Old Dominion's numbers are currently waiting for a paper check to be mailed, so it'll still be probably a couple weeks before I get that information. Now, again, I'm always said this, that, the business sense is one thing. I've always been more of a common sense guy, so let's go back to football real quick. Before, if we can operate, we can have 14 or I guess at this point 14 sports, because you're not having football and rowing before you guys came in the 09 season, on $20 million. How it's like, well, you've got now 16 on $45 million. So it's one of those things where, yes, the student fees clearly impact that, but it's one of those things. It's like, okay, you make it up. I guess my question is too, is that fundraising, that accounting, in situations where Division III schools add men's and women's wrestling to get people in the door because they're tuition dollars. You're at a headcount sport where you bring a guy in, you've got a certain amount of walk-ons, and that's helping the university bottom line. Whereas you've got 35 wrestlers on the team with a total of 9.9. That's a sport that the NCAA wouldn't even allow you to fund fully a full starting lineup. And all those people coming in are their dorms, their room and board, their tuition money. So those make the university a bottom line. And it's weird how Division III will include that as a gain for the school, yet D1 athletic budgets really don't seem to accommodate for walk-ons that are paying or students that are getting a quarter of a ride or books that are paying money to the university as part of the bottom line. So again, this is more of a philosophical debate than it is it's a charge. I'm not saying it. This is something one way or the other. But again, football, you guys do get a lot more, I guess, leeway with the full scholarship, whereas bringing in the local wrestler who's going to pay full tuition helps the school, but it doesn't necessarily help the athletic department. Those are separate. It's kind of weird to me that some schools do that and some schools don't.
Yeah, I couldn't explain to you the difference in why some do, some don't. I know I had 31 walk-ons, Jason. I had the most walk-ons of any sport on campus. I had 31 players paying full tuition to go to school to ODU. Granted, I had 85 scholarships, but 31 student athletes paying. So we were also helping in that regard. Now, when you talk, Jason, in terms of where did all the additional money go? Well, your FOIA will answer that question, but let me also point out that when you add football, when you add rowing, when you add volleyball, all of a sudden you've got to add another a couple more associate ADs at $100,000 a year, and a couple more people in compliance that total $100,000 a year, and now you've got 3 or 4 more academic advisors that are another $100,000 to $200,000 per year. You get my point, Jason. You've got to add all these additional people to oversee the different areas, whether it be an assistant athletic director, academic advisor, people in compliance, all these positions that are added. You've got maintenance of facilities. You've got all this team travel that goes into it. So there's a really broad stroke with that brush that when you get the information from the FOIA and you look at those things, I'm sure you'll be able to make sense of it.
Yeah, as long as the university lawyers don't make fun of me for being a reporter or not. But anyway, that's a different story entirely. But in the time we got left, Coach, I know that again some of the wrestling people that are going to be listening to this aren't going to be pleased with some of the answers, and you've shot down some of my arguments clearly, and I think I've thrown some things back at you worth thinking about. But as it relates to,
hey, make sure you tell all your wrestling people how much of a wrestling fan that I am. Okay. Make sure they completely understand that my son almost won 2 state championships. I love wrestling, and I've tried to come up with as many solutions as I can today, Jason, because all due respect to you, to me, to everybody listening that's upset that Old Dominion dropped wrestling, that's not going to change anything. We can go on Twitter, we can write letters, we can do all that crap. Right now, we need solutions. We need answers to how do we support these sports? Like I'm saying to you, get Murray Rudisell on your show. Let your listeners hear a guy who funds his own program, and how does he do it? So I want to see some solutions to some of these things. Instead of playing the blame game, which is really easy to do, that's part of what we do in society. I used to say this to my players all the time. Don't come to me with a problem unless you've already thought of the solution. Let's have an idea. I'd have a kid who got in trouble. Okay, I know you got in trouble. You're going to tell me you're sorry right now. What is the solution? How do we solve this problem? So we've got to be problem solvers right now together for all of the Olympic sports across the country.
All right, last question as we get to it. In terms of how this was handled, because I immediately requested an interview with Wood Selig. He's been on my ODU wrestling show, which Old Dominion paid for. They wouldn't even, they said no. They said no, our decision's done. The lack of transparency, I guess the lack of, they wouldn't talk to the newspapers. They wouldn't talk to the pilot. I had basically kind of, I'm going to say I used some creative social media strategy to get them to answer 10 questions on a Q&A. Some of those questions weren't even answered. One of those questions was a complete fabrication in terms of the answers. But I guess why, okay, so here it is. So you make the decision, hypothetical. The PR campaign around this, or the I guess there was probably a better way to handle this, and I still haven't been allowed a phone interview with Wood Selig. I don't think I will be. So do you think that's something that you feel the school should have handled differently? Again, not being an employee anymore, but looking at it from an outside viewpoint.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think when you've got a sport, a tradition like Old Dominion wrestling, a coach like Steve Martin, so many people like yourself that love the sport, you stand up in front of the microphone and you take the arrows because you're going to get them, but that's your job as the athletic director. I'll use myself an example, Jason, so people don't think I'm just blowing smoke here. 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, December 2nd, Wood Selig comes in my office, tells me I'm no longer the coach, gives me the option to be fired or resign. I decide to resign. I tell the staff at 8:30. I have a team meeting at 9. I come back, get with Wood Selig. I said, hey, I do a press conference at noon. I want to do it today. He says, well, I'd rather you not. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm going to stand in front of the microphone and I'm going to explain what happened. I don't know if you, Jason, or any of your listeners have seen my final interview. It got national attention for a coach who actually stood up and took ownership of what just happened with his program. And, I talked about what an honor it was to be the head coach. Now, this is different than getting your program dropped. I got let go. But my point is, when you're in a position of leadership, when you're in charge of something, I was in charge of the football program. I failed my last year. Yes, I was 77-56 as a head coach, built the best startup program. We went 1-11 the last year, so I lost my job. I stood up in front of the microphone. All my coaches were there, most of the team, all the media, and I explained to people what happened and why, because everybody deserved closure. And right now, in my opinion, Wood Selig did not handle this the right way. He should have stood in front of the microphone. He should have been there with Steve Martin, explaining it. I assume they met in person. I don't know, but you have to be transparent in this case. You can't hide behind a press release or just answer questions on your computer. You've got to stand up and you've got to own it. I did it every time I was a head coach. When we got our ass kicked, I stood up and owned it. It's on me. I got to coach better. When you're an athletic director and you do something like this, you have to own it. Now, I mentioned to you before, Jason, my oldest son, Derek, is a student. He was up in Pennsylvania with his girlfriend. He got an email that came from the athletic director, went to all the student athletes explaining that wrestling just got dropped and hopefully they would be there for their fellow students, and here's why they dropped it. Same thing. It was an email message that was sent out, which I think that was a good idea. You had to get the message out to all the kids, but you've got to stand in front of the microphone and you've got to own it when you're a leader.
And I think that's the one thing. And I would have probably fought this just as vigilant if the cut was, and then, Wood came. Yeah, I'll do your show. Yeah, I'll talk to the Daily Press and the Virginia Pilot and Wavy and WTKR and VEC. I don't want to leave out any of the news stations there, but that's the one thing. It was just a run and hide. And I'll be honest with you, I've gone through this I guess process with numerous athletic directors in my media career, and the AD at Cleveland State came on my show. The AD at Anderson University came on my show. The AD at Truman State came on my show. The ADs that ducked me, University of Oregon, the previous AD at Fresno State, the AD at Old Dominion, my alma mater, where I thought we did things a little differently. I thought we did them better. And usually those are the things where it just seems like you're hiding something. And if you, like I said, own it. And like you said, own it. That's what I want. Honestly, I wanted a chance to save the program, but if we're going to make a hard decision, I want you to own that decision and not hide from it. So that is where I'm also coming from point of this. And I'm glad we've had this conversation again. There are people that are going to say that, oh, well, Coach Wilder shut down all of my arguments. And then there are people say, well, he's a football coach. He's going to say this. And I think you were really frank and open, and I appreciate your time. And again, I don't know if everything we believe is in sync, and I can see your side, and I'm sure you can see some of the things I'm worried about. But again, the ultimate point was we ran from this as a university, and that is probably the one thing that bothers me the most. Okay, the second thing, we didn't have a chance to save it, and then you ran from us. So, and now you're auctioning the mats, so you're kicking us in the chips, and then doing it again while we're down. So
yeah, and Jason, I want to say respectfully, I get your point as an alumnus. And like I said to you, I loved our wrestling program. I'm a huge fan of Steve Martin. He'll be back. He'll be coaching wrestling somewhere. And it hurts. It hurts to see that program get dropped and not see the athletic director step up and own the fact. And the last thing I'll say to you, this was great being on your show. To everybody out there, think of as many ways as you can right now to save men's Olympic sports across the board, because that's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about women's Olympic sports unless schools just drop their athletic departments. The women's Olympic sports, opposite of football and men's basketball, are going to be fine. It's the men's Olympic sports we need to be fearful of right now, and we all need to do a good job rallying together, coming up with ideas. Some of them, I gave you today that I feel strongly about involve fundraising and the alumni for those sports, and get out in front of it right now. Get out in front of it, and let's save as many of these men's Olympic sports as we can moving forward.
And lastly, to just answer I've said lastly a couple times now, for those Monarch Nation that aren't listening here for the wrestling, they want to hear what Coach Wilder's up to. What's next for you?
Well, I was getting ready to interview for broadcasting jobs with ESPN and CBS Sports, hopefully Fox, to do color analysis for college football games. That's always been my second passion. I love, as you can tell, Jason, I'm not afraid of the microphone. I love doing interviews and talking about my passion, which is sports and college athletics. And I've always done TV shows and radio shows. So that's what is most likely in the future for me. I was supposed to interview earlier this month, but then obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, that put everything on hold. So hopefully that'll be life's next adventure.
Bobby Wilder, thanks for the time, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, anytime, Jason. I'd love to come on your show again. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. It was great speaking with you, and wish you nothing but the best.
The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Sportswear. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. Hey, you know what? Did you like the show? You want to hit that subscribe button, MattTalkOnline.com/listen. Various different ways to subscribe to this show on your favorite podcatcher of choice. And if you're already subscribed and you already listen, you love the show and you want to support this show and this network, MattTalkOnline.com/join the team. Become a team member today.